I need you to come get me right now." Maria's whisper was barely audible over the church choir, her knuckles white around the phone hidden in her lace glove. She stood at the baptismal font, her infant daughter in her arms, holy water still glistening on the child's forehead. Beside her, her husband smiled for the family photos, his grip on her elbow a silent, brutal warning. In 60 seconds, the reception would begin. In 60 seconds, the facade of their perfect family would resume. But Maria was done. Her thumb found the single contact, saved under a fake name, and pressed call. The man who answered wasn't a policeman or a counselor. He was a mafia boss, and she was begging him for sanctuary in the house of God. This is Maria Rossi, a mother of 3 from Calabria, Italy. For 6 years, she endured what 6.8 million Italian women have survived: systematic violence at the hands of the man who promised to love her. Police reports went nowhere. Restraining orders were just paper. Tonight, at her daughter's baptism, with her entire extended family watching, she realized the system had abandoned her. So she turned to the one power her husband truly feared, the 'Ndrangheta Mafia. But this decision would ignite a chain reaction, exposing Italy's dual epidemic, domestic terror and organized crime, and force us to ask, when the state fails, where does a woman turn for protection? Maria's story didn't begin at the font. It began 7 years earlier, when she was 22 and Marco Rossi was the charming son of a respected local businessman. Their wedding was a modest affair in their small Calabrian town, a place where the 'Ndrangheta's influence was as ordinary as the morning espresso. The first slap came 16 months later, a shocking crack across the face because dinner was 10 minutes late. He cried afterward, showered her with gifts, and promised it would never happen again. This is the cycle, the tension, the explosion, the honeymoon phase that traps millions. In Italy, a woman is killed by a partner or family member every 3 days. Maria didn't know that statistic then. She just knew the shame, the isolation he engineered, cutting her off from friends, monitoring her phone. The violence escalated after the birth of their first son, a shove down the stairs that she explained as a fall, a broken wrist from a wrench. Each time the apologies grew shorter, the gifts disappeared. Her world shrank to the walls of their home. This is the brutal mathematics of coercive control. In 82% of Italian cases, the home is the crime scene. Maria became a prisoner in a beautiful cage, her husband a warden who loved her. He said too much. When she finally gathered the courage, she went to the Carabinieri station. She showed them the bruises. She filed a report known as a denuncia. This is where the system's first failure clicks into place. The officer was polite, even sympathetic, but his questions had a familiar slant. What did you do to provoke him? Are you sure you want to ruin your family? He issued a warning to Marco, a piece of paper known as an *ammonimento*. It was, Maria soon learned, worthless. Because here is the fatal flaw in Italy's protection framework. While police can remove an abuser from the home for urgent cases, there is no nationwide, coordinated safety net like those for mafia informants. A judge can grant a restraining order, but enforcement is patchy. For Maria, the ammonimento was a death warrant. Marco came home that night enraged. "You humiliate me." The beating was the worst yet. He took her phone. He told her if she went back, he would take the children and she would never see them again. He knew the law and he knew its weaknesses. This is the reality for the 89.6% of Italian women who never report at all. The risk is too high. The protection is too low. So Maria tried the silent route. She contacted a women's shelter, a faint hope whispered about in town. But Calabria has one of the lowest ratios of shelter beds to population in Europe. The nearest safe house with space was over 100 kilometers away. She had no money of her own, no car, 3 young children. The system asked her to perform an escape act with no resources. This is the economic trap. Gender-based violence costs Italy €20.3 billion a year in healthcare, lost productivity, and social services, yet funding for escape routes remains criminally insufficient. Maria was stuck. And while Marco's business flourished, he was in fact a mid-level operative for the local 'Ndrangheta clan, running a construction front that laundered money. The clan's boss, Salvatore Mancini, was a ghost in their lives, a man discussed in hushed tones whose name commanded instant obedience. Marco would leave for meetings, coming home with thick envelopes of cash and a more volatile temper. The mafia wasn't just his job, it was the architecture of his power. It meant the police in town were hesitant. It meant neighbors turned a blind eye. In Maria's world, the law was abstract and distant. The Ndrangheta was immediate and real. Its rules were clear, its punishments severe and absolute. The baptism was supposed to be a ceasefire, a sacred day for family. Marco insisted on a huge celebration, inviting associates whose faces she didn't recognize. He wanted to show off his beautiful family, his dominance. As she held her daughter, Chiara, in the beautiful white gown, she felt his hand on the small of her back, a possessive clamp. During the photos, his fingers dug into her arm, a silent reminder, "Smile for my friends." It was in that moment, surrounded by 200 people in the house of God, that Maria experienced the most profound loneliness. She was performing happiness in a room full of witnesses, and not one of them could see her screaming inside. Less than 40% of women seek any help. She understood why. Then, during the reception, she overheard two of Marco's associates talking by the punch bowl. They were discussing a debtor who had failed to pay a loan. "Salvatore sorted it," one man chuckled. "The guy won't be walking without a limp for a year, but he paid. He always gets what is owed." Something in Maria's mind, a wire stretched to its breaking point, finally snapped. The state had given her a paper warning. Salvatore Mancini got results. It was a monstrous calculation, born of pure terror. While Marco held court across the room, she took her daughter, pretended to need the changing room, and locked herself in a bathroom stall. Her hands shook so violently she could barely dial. She had the number not from Marco, but from a slip of paper she'd found hidden in his office months prior, a number labeled only S. She had memorized it, a dark talisman she never thought she'd use. The phone rang twice. A deep, calm voice answered, "Pronto," and Maria, with the holy water still drying on her baby's head, whispered the words that would tear her life in two. "I need you to come get me right now." There was a pause. "Who is this?" "Maria, Marco Rossi's wife." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear the faint sound of a television in the background. Then Salvatore Mancini, a man who ordered murders before breakfast, said three words that changed everything. "Stay where you are." The line went dead. Maria leaned her forehead against the cold stall door. What had she just done? She had traded one terrifying power for another. She had just invited the wolf into the church to save her from the snake. And outside the door, the party music played on, completely unaware that the world was about to explode. For the next 17 minutes, Maria performed the greatest act of her life. She walked out of that bathroom, smoothed her dress, pasted on a smile, and re-entered the roaring baptism reception. She took Chiara back from her mother-in-law, made small talk with aunts, even laughed at one of Marco's crude jokes, all while her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every glance at the grand church entrance was a silent scream. What had she done? Salvatore Mancini was not a social worker. He was a man who governed through fear. By calling him, she hadn't just asked for help. She had declared Marco in violation of a different, more ancient law, the Ndrangheta's perverse code of family honor. In the world of organized crime, the family is everything, but it is a rigid, brutal institution. Women are often relegated to silent roles, bearers of children and keepers of secrets. Yet, as researcher Anna Sergi explains, the Ndrangheta's extreme focus on blood relations creates a twisted paradox. A man who publicly brutalizes his own wife and mother of his children isn't just a thug. He's destabilizing the very clan structure he claims to uphold. He's showing weakness. He's attracting police attention. For a boss like Salvatore, Maria's call wasn't a plea. It was a complaint against one of his soldiers for misconduct, and he would adjudicate it. The arrival was silent but absolute. At exactly 6:42 p.m., the large oak doors of the church hall swung inward, not with a crash but with a slow, authoritative push. Three men walked in. They weren't dressed as gangsters from a film. They wore neat, dark suits. They didn't speak. They simply stood inside the doorway, scanning the room. The music didn't stop, but the energy shifted. A chill moved through the crowd like a draft. Conversations dipped. Marco, holding a glass of whiskey, froze mid-sentence. He recognized them instantly. These were Salvatore's *Pixiotti*, his trusted soldiers. One of the men, older with a scar tracing his jawline, caught Maria's eye from across the room. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. This was it. Her legs felt like water. Marco was now striding toward the men, his face a mask of confused anger. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice too loud. The scarred man ignored him, his gaze finding Maria again. He gestured slightly with his head toward the door. The instruction was clear, come, now. Every instinct told her to run to the carabinieri, to the priests, to anyone in a uniform. But that was the old logic, the logic that had failed her. The only authority that had ever answered her call was standing in that doorway. Clutching Chiara to her chest, she began to walk. The sea of guests parted silently. She passed her stunned mother, her confused father. She passed Marco, whose expression had shifted from anger to dawning, terrifying comprehension. Maria, he hissed, grabbing her arm. The scarred man took one step forward. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Marco's hand on Maria's arm. Marco released her as if burned. Outside, the evening air was cool. A black Mercedes sedan was idling at the curb. The rear door was open. Inside, she saw the profile of Salvatore Mancini. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, examining a document. He looked like a retired accountant, not a crime lord. He didn't look up as she hesitantly slid into the seat beside him, the car door closing with a soft, final asterisk thunk asterisk. The children. He asked, still reading. At the party, with my parents-in-law, Maria stammered. Salvatore finally looked at her, then at the baby in her arms. He nodded to the man in the passenger seat, who made a quick phone call. They will be brought to you, Salvatore said calmly. No one will touch them. This is the pivot. Maria hadn't escaped the violence. She had transferred her dependency from one authoritarian structure to another, far more powerful one. In the desperate calculus of survival, the Mafia's brutal efficiency can seem preferable to the state's bureaucratic failure. As one anti-mafia prosecutor later told me, when the institutions are absent, the criminal organization fills the vacuum. It becomes the state. At that moment, speeding away from the church, Maria felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. It was an illusion, and a dangerous one. Salvatore did not take her to a hidden safe house. He took her to his own home, a fortified villa on the outskirts of town. His wife, Gabriella, a woman with kind eyes and a stern mouth, welcomed her without question, showing her to a guest room. There was food, clothes for the baby. It was orderly, calm, and utterly surreal. Later that night, Salvatore laid out the new rules. Marco would not contact her. He would not come near her. He would sign papers granting her immediate legal separation and providing financial support. If he disputes this, Salvatore said, sipping an espresso, he will be dealing with me. The message was clear. The full weight of clan discipline now protected Maria, but protection in this world is never free. It is a debt. Back at the baptism reception, chaos had erupted and then been brutally suppressed. Marco, humiliated in front of his entire world, had raged, but his own father and uncles, men also connected to the clan, had silenced him. You fool, his father had whispered fiercely. You brought this on us. You couldn't control your own house. Marco's violence, once his private tool of domination, was now a public liability. The clan's reputation for iron discipline was at stake. For the Ndrangheta, image is power. A soldier who cannot manage his family is a loose cannon, a risk to security. Marco was given his orders: stay away, comply, or be caxiato asterisk, expelled from the clan, a fate often worse than death. For 3 days, Maria lived in the quiet villa. Her 2 older sons were brought to her, confused but unharmed. The system that had failed her for years, the police, the courts, social services, had not produced this result. A single phone call to a criminal had. This fact is the explosive core of the story. It demonstrates a catastrophic institutional abdication. Why did a mafia boss achieve in hours what the state could not in years? The answer lies in the numbers. Italy has a severe shortage of women's shelters, particularly in the south. Judges are overwhelmed. Restraining orders are often not enforced due to lack of resources. Meanwhile, the Ndrangheta has a surplus of enforcers and a vested interest in maintaining social control. On the 4th day, the other shoe dropped. Salvatore requested Maria join him in his study. He was not alone. A lawyer was present, a sleek man from Milan. Signora Rossi, Salvatore began, the situation with your husband is settled, but now we must discuss your situation with us. He explained in polite, legalistic terms the debt. By intervening, he had invested his authority. That investment required a return. Maria would not be asked to traffic drugs or carry a weapon. Her duty was simpler and more insidious: silence and loyalty. She was now under the clan's *Prozioni*. In exchange, she was expected to be a model-separated wife, to never speak to authorities about clan business, and to be, essentially, a living testament to Salvatore's benevolent control. She had left Marco's prison and entered Salvatore's gilded cage. The lawyer presented documents, a legally binding separation agreement drafted by Marco's new clan-appointed lawyer, giving her full custody and a generous monthly allowance drawn from Marco's business. It was everything she had ever legally fought for, and it was utterly tainted. If she signed, she was accepting the Mafia's justice and binding herself to its silence. If she refused, the protection vanished. She would be back on the street with 3 children, with an enraged husband who now had something to prove. She signed. The cost of her freedom was her complicity. News of the bizarre baptism intervention began to leak through the town's gossip network. Whispers became stories. The story reached the wrong ears. A young, ambitious deputy prosecutor named Giulia Conti, who had been building a money laundering case against Marco Rossi's construction business. When she heard that Marco's wife had been taken by boss Mancini himself, her investigative instincts fired. This wasn't just a domestic dispute, it was a potential crack in the clan's armor. A vulnerable, frightened woman inside the boss's home could be a witness, or she could be a hostage. Prosecutor Conti did something unprecedented. She opened a dual file, one for money laundering and a new one, titled Operazioni Salvagent, Operation Lifeboy, focusing on Maria Rossi as a potential victim of both domestic violence and mafia coercion. This is where Maria's personal nightmare collided with the Italian state's war on organized crime, and it created an impossible conflict. The anti-mafia police, the DIA, wanted to use Maria to get to Salvatore. The social services, now belatedly alerted, wanted to extract her and her children to a safe house far away, but Maria trusted neither. The state had failed her. The mafia, however horrifying, had delivered. When Prosecutor Conti finally secured a warrant and sent 2 female officers to Salvatore's villa to offer Maria state protection, the meeting was a disaster. Maria, sitting in Gabriella's parlor with a clan lawyer present, refused to speak. She denied being coerced. She said she was a guest, recovering from a marital breakdown. The officers left empty-handed. From their perspective, Maria was a classic victim, trapped by fear. From Maria's perspective, the state's offer felt like a trap, a promise that had already been broken too many times. The standoff escalated quietly but dramatically. Marco, pressured by the clan and now under prosecution scrutiny, made a desperate move. He went to the Carabinieri. He filed a formal complaint, not against Salvatore for kidnapping, but against Maria for parental alienation and for conspiring with known criminals to extort money from him. It was a brilliant, vicious legal counterattack. Suddenly, Maria wasn't just a victim in the eyes of the law, she was a suspect. The very documents Salvatore had forced Marco to sign were now being framed as evidence of her collusion. The system she had avoided was now closing in on her from all sides, and it had the power to take her children for being in an environment of criminal association. Maria was now trapped in a no-man's land between 3 powerful, violent forces: her vengeful husband, the possessive mafia boss, and the relentless state prosecutor. Each wanted control of her story. Each claimed to be acting in her best interest. And Maria, holding her daughter in a villa that was both sanctuary and prison, realized the terrifying truth. Her phone call from the baptism hadn't been a rescue. It had been the first move in a much larger, more dangerous game. And she was no longer a player. She was the prize. The walls were closing in, and the only way out might require her to betray the devil who saved her, if she could even figure out who the devil really was. The villa's gates were always open for Maria to leave. That was the cruelest part. Salvatore never locked her in. He didn't need to. Her prison was built from fear and gratitude, a psychological cage far stronger than any lock. Prosecutor Conti's failed intervention had an unintended consequence. It solidified Maria's bond with her captors. The state's clumsy attempt felt like an attack, while the clan's protection felt like a shield. This is the Stockholm syndrome of systemic failure. When institutions are the enemy, the criminal protector becomes the hero. But the pressure was building on all fronts. Marco's legal counterattack was just the beginning. His father, a respected elder in the clan's outer circle, began a quiet campaign to discredit Maria. Whispers spread that she was unstable, that she had fabricated the abuse, that she was trying to extort the family. In a town where social reputation is currency, Maria's value was plummeting. Then, the first anonymous threat arrived. A note slipped under the villa's gate, written in cut-out magazine letters, "A mother's duty is silence. Remember your children." It wasn't signed, but Maria knew. It was Marco's warning, delivered through the clan's own channels. He was testing Salvatore's resolve. Salvatore's response was swift and brutal. 2 days later, Marco's construction office was firebombed in the middle of the night. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. The boss's protection was absolute, and challenges would be met with disproportionate force. Maria saw the news on television, Gabriella sitting stoically beside her. "He protects what is his," Gabriella said quietly, but the word "his" hung in the air. Maria was now property. This violent escalation triggered the "wait, it gets worse" moment. The firebombing drew the full attention of the ROS, the Carabinieri's elite anti-mafia unit. They weren't interested in a domestic dispute. They saw a clan asserting territorial control through arson. Maria's case file on Prosecutor Conti's desk was now cross-referenced with a major organized crime investigation. She was no longer just a victim or a suspect. She was a person of interest in a mafia war. This meant wiretaps on the villa's phones, surveillance on her movements, and forensic accountants dissecting the generous allowance she was receiving. The state was building a case, and Maria was at the center of it, whether she cooperated or not. Inside the villa, the atmosphere shifted. The polite distance turned into subtle indoctrination. Gabriella began involving Maria in the clan's social affairs, organizing charity dinners, visiting elderly relatives of the family. These were classic mafia tactics, weaving her into the social fabric of the organization, creating witnesses to her participation, normalizing her presence. Maria was being groomed. She was learning that in the Ndrangheta, women don't just keep secrets, they become the public face of normalcy that hides the crime. Her compliance was no longer enough. Active participation was now required. Then came the second, more shocking revelation. Through fragments of conversation and a careless comment from Gabriella, Maria pieced together the real reason for Salvatore's intervention. It wasn't about honor or justice. It was about business. Marco's construction company was a critical piece of a multi-million-euro public works fraud scheme. His erratic, violent behavior was drawing unwanted police attention, threatening the entire operation. By taking Maria in, Salvatore wasn't just disciplining a soldier, he was seizing control of a key asset. He was stabilizing the business. Maria and her children were human collateral, guaranteeing Marco's continued, docile cooperation. Her safety was a side effect of a corporate takeover. This reframed everything. The baptism call wasn't an answered prayer. It was a strategic opportunity Salvatore had been waiting for. Maria's terror had been his leverage. The realization was like ice water in her veins. She had traded a violent husband for a merciless CEO, and the terms of her employment were becoming clear. A week later, Salvatore's lawyer presented her with new documents. They were application forms for regional business grants and childcare subsidies. The lawyer explained, in calm detail, how she would apply for these state funds using her new legal status as a single mother. The money would be clean, traceable, and would help support her children. It would also, indirectly, free up more of Marco's illicit profits to be funneled back into the clan's coffers. She was being turned into a financial conduit, a money laundering instrument. If she refused, the protection vanished. If she complied, she became an active participant in mafia finance, a crime with a minimum prison sentence of 10 years. This was the trap snapping shut. The system that had abandoned her was now, through these very social programs, being used to entrap her. The irony was savage. Maria signed the forms. Each signature felt like another brick in the wall around her. Meanwhile, Prosecutor Conti was making her own brutal calculation. Her wiretaps were capturing nothing incriminating from Maria, just mundane conversations about children and groceries. But they were capturing Marco's rage and Salvatore's cold commands. She realized she didn't need Maria to testify against the clan. She needed Maria to provoke the clan. Conti's team devised a risky strategy. They would publicly leak, through controlled channels, that Maria Rossi was cooperating with authorities. It was a lie, but it was a lie designed to make the clan turn on her. If Salvatore believed Maria was an informant, he would either silence her or cast her out. either of which could give Conti an opening. The leak hit the local news as a vague, unnamed source close to the investigation. Within hours, the villa's atmosphere turned to frost. Salvatore did not confront Maria. He didn't need to. Gabriella stopped speaking to her. The friendly guards became silent sentinels. Meals were left outside her door. Maria was now in isolation within the gilded cage. The protection had morphed into a threat. She was now a liability to be managed. That night, Maria found a burner phone tucked inside a bag of groceries delivered from town. There was no note. It rang once, an hour later. A woman's voice, one she recognized from her single meeting. It was one of the female carabinieri officers from Prosecutor Conti's team. Maria, listen carefully. We know you're not talking to us, but they think you are. That makes you a target. We can extract you and your children tonight, but you have to say yes now. This is your only chance. The line went dead. Maria stared at the phone. It was a lifeline thrown by the same state that had failed her, a lifeline that existed only because of a lie. To take it meant trusting the very system that had abandoned her and betraying the only power that had ever answered her call. But to stay meant becoming a permanent prisoner of a criminal empire, or worse, a body in a shallow grave. She had 1 hour to decide. She looked at her 3 sleeping children in the next room. She looked at the ornate walls of the villa that had been her sanctuary and her prison. She thought of Marco's fists, Salvatore's cold calculations, and Prosecutor Conti's manipulative leak. Every authority in her life, marital, criminal, state, had used her as a pawn. The baptism had been 56 days ago. In those 56 days, she had learned a terrible truth. In the economy of power, a desperate woman is a currency to be spent. But as she held the burner phone, a new thought, fierce and fragile, took root. What if she stopped being the currency? What if she became the banker? What if she played them all against each other? She picked up the phone. She didn't call the carabinieri back. Instead, she typed a text message to the only number saved in its memory. She wrote 4 words, "I have conditions, meet." She was no longer asking for rescue. She was opening negotiations. The phone buzzed 2 minutes later with a single word. Where? Maria Rossi, the abused wife, the Mafia pawn, the state's reluctant witness, was about to make her first move. The game was changing, and for the first time, she was picking up the pieces. Maria chose the meeting place with the precision of a general, the children's play area in the town's public park. It was a Saturday morning, crowded with families. She arrived with her 3 children in tow, a visible public shield. Prosecutor Giulia Conti arrived alone, dressed casually, blending in as a mother. They sat on adjacent benches, watching their children play, 2 women conducting a negotiation that would determine the course of multiple lives and investigations. Maria spoke first, her voice low but steady. "I want my children in a school in Milan, registered under new names. I want a guaranteed job, not state welfare. I want a 10-year restraining order against Marco that is actually enforced by someone you appoint. And I want immunity from prosecution for anything I was forced to sign in that villa." Conti listened, then countered. "And in return," Maria turned to look at her directly, "in return, I will give you Salvatore Mancini. Not Marco, the boss." This was the pivot. Maria had realized that Marco was a symptom, Salvatore was the disease, and she had something the prosecutor desperately needed: intimate knowledge of the villa's routines, the comings and goings of key figures, the hidden safe in the study, the coded language used in family meetings. She wasn't offering to wear a wire. She was offering to be a living blueprint of the clan's inner workings, but her conditions were non-negotiable. She was not entering witness protection to hide in fear. She was demanding a new, autonomous life built on her own terms. After 2 hours of tense negotiation, Conti agreed. Operation Lifeboy had its star witness, but on Maria's conditions. The extraction plan was set for 72 hours later. What happened next was a masterclass in tactical deception. Maria returned to the villa and resumed her role as the subdued, grateful guest. But now, every detail was fuel. She memorized security camera blind spots, noted the guard shift changes, and discreetly photographed documents left on desks. She used the burner phone to send encrypted updates to a dedicated handler. Meanwhile, Conti's team moved with unprecedented speed. They secured a safe apartment in Milan through an anti-mafia nonprofit, arranged forged school documents, and coordinated with a rare, dedicated protection unit for high-risk witnesses. This was not the sluggish state machinery that had failed Maria before. This was a targeted, well-resourced offensive. On the morning of the extraction, Maria did exactly as instructed. She told Gabriella she was taking the children to a doctor's appointment in the next town, a prearranged cover. A clan driver took them. But halfway there, Maria claimed her youngest son was carsick. They pulled over at a designated roadside cafe. The driver waited in the car. Maria took the children inside. Within seconds, she and the children were ushered out the back door by two plainclothes officers and into an unmarked van. The driver, growing suspicious, came inside to look for them. He found only an empty bathroom and a paid bill on the table. By the time he radioed the villa, the van was merging onto the autostrada, heading north at high speed. The cage was open. Salvatore's reaction was volcanic, but contained. A public search would admit a failure of control. Instead, he turned his fury on Marco, blaming him for creating the situation. Marco was demoted within the clan, his assets frozen. The clan's internal discipline was cracking under the strain. Meanwhile, in Milan, Maria and her children began the painstaking process of building a new life. The promised protections were implemented: new identities, a job for Maria as a baker's assistant, using her old skills in a new context, and a security detail. For the first time in years, Maria slept through the night. But her work was just beginning. Over the next 6 months, she worked daily with Prosecutor Conti and a specialized magistrate, providing testimony that was meticulous and devastating. She didn't just give names and dates. She explained the clan's social structure, its system of favors and punishments, its manipulation of local businesses. Her testimony became the backbone of a massive, multi-agency operation. In the early hours of a Tuesday morning, 120 officers simultaneously raided 23 locations across Calabria and Lombardy. Salvatore Mancini was arrested at his villa, still in his pajamas. 27 associates, including Marco, were taken into custody. The charges ranged from extortion and money laundering to mafia association, and for Marco, domestic violence aggravated by mafia methods. The trial that followed was a national spectacle. Maria testified behind a screen, her voice distorted. Her testimony lasted 3 days. She described the baptism call, the villa, the financial schemes, and the psychological coercion. She did not portray herself as a helpless victim. She presented as a woman who made terrible choices between worse options, a portrayal that gave her testimony raw, undeniable credibility. The defense tried to attack her character, but her calm, detailed responses undercut them. The jury saw a survivor, not a pawn. The verdicts were landmark. Salvatore Mancini was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Marco received 12 years for mafia association and aggravated assault. 15 other clan members received significant sentences, but the real victory was systemic. The case exposed the deadly intersection of domestic violence and organized crime, forcing a national conversation. In its wake, the Italian parliament fast-tracked funding for 50 new women's shelters in the south and created a pilot program that embedded anti-mafia prosecutors with domestic violence units. It was named, unofficially, the Rossi Protocol. Here is the final, surprising detail. Maria did not disappear after the trial. With her new identity secure, she did something extraordinary. She used her settlement money to open a small bakery in a quiet Milan neighborhood. But she also began volunteering as a consultant for the new Rossi Protocol teams, training prosecutors and social workers on the unique vulnerabilities of women in mafia-affected areas. She turned her trauma into expertise. She became, in the words of one journalist, the most formidable insider the state never expected. 1 year after the trial, Maria received a letter forwarded through her lawyer. It was from Salvatore Mancini, written from his maximum security prison. It contained no threats. It was a single handwritten line: "You were always stronger than the rest of us." She burned the letter. She did not need his validation. Her strength was no longer a secret she kept in a bathroom stall. It was the foundation of her new life, built brick by brick, far from the font where it all began. The story that started with a desperate whisper in a church had ended not with a rescue, but with a reckoning, and the birth of a woman who finally answered her own call. Maria Rossi's story is not an anomaly. It is a stress test. It asks what happens when every legitimate institution, The police, the courts, social services fails a woman in the precise moment she needs them most. The data provides a chilling answer. With less than 40% of victims seeking help and a critical shortage of shelter beds, a void opens. And into that void steps a power that operates on a different set of rules, absolute, swift, and merciless. The Ndrangheta didn't save Maria out of compassion. It enforced order. It filled the vacuum left by the state. This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable equation. When protection is absent, desperate people will seek safety from any source, even if that source is monstrous. The cost of that safety is a different kind of bondage. Maria's journey from victim to pawn to witness to consultant maps the brutal trajectory of a system playing catch-up. The reforms born from her case, the new shelters, the Rossi Protocol, are vital, but they are also an admission of profound prior failure. The lingering question is not about Maria's strength, which is undeniable. It is about our collective vulnerability. In how many towns, in how many countries, does this same deadly calculus play out in silence, where the abuser and the local crime boss are two faces of the same coercive power? The statistics are not just numbers, they are a warning. 24 people per minute. One woman killed every 3 days in Italy. A €20.3 billion annual cost. These figures measure a crisis of trust. When the systems meant to protect become unreliable, where do you turn? Maria turned, ultimately, back to the state, but on her own revolutionary terms. She negotiated her rescue and then helped rebuild the very institutions that had failed her. In doing so, she provided a blueprint not just for prosecutors, but for survival. Her story ends not with a fairy tale, but with a hard-won reality. Safety should not be a transaction. It is a fundamental right. If this story revealed anything, it's that the line between justice and vengeance, between protection and possession, is terrifyingly thin. And in that narrow space, entire lives hang in the balance. The real victory would be a world where no mother ever has to calculate the cost of her own rescue. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive into the shadows where crime and systemic failure meet compelling, make sure to subscribe. We unravel another complex, real-world story every week.